Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our 85th webinar. Crikey, 85 webinars. Who'd have thought we'd have been going this long? You must be getting bored of us all now. No, joking. You are very welcome. And we have a question for you tonight while we're all coming in and settling down. Dave, what's our question?
If you could let us know in the chat, what's the most exciting thing that's happened to you this week? It could be anything. You literally could have got someone to make you a cup of tea, or you could have climbed Kilimanjaro. Just let us know.
I wonder if anybody has climbed Kilimanjaro this week.
That would be amazing.
That would be quite awesome, wouldn't it?
Right. Oh, I've just come back for this webinar from Kilimanjaro.
Oh, I'm at the top of Kilimanjaro right now, listening to the webinar.
You did Kilimanjaro twice this week, Kai.
Oh.
Okay. All right,
well,
sure.
There you go. So tell us where you are. Tell us if you are a student or a social worker. And yeah, tell us what is the most exciting thing that has happened to you this week.
Okay, so tonight in our 85th webinar, thank you very much for opening up for us there, Dave and Chris. We thought we'd go for a different question tonight instead of what have you had for your tea, partly because I've not eaten yet, and if I was reading what have you had for your tea, it'd make me too hungry. So we thought we'd go for a different what's been the most exciting part of your week so far. But tonight we are looking at relationship-based practice. It's one of our back to basics webinars. So earlier on, when I was thinking about putting the session together tonight, I was thinking about why did I suggest this? Because it's something that I've had to prepare for tonight from scratch, and I was like, why did I suggest this? And then I remembered why I suggested it is because our back to basics sessions are often very popular, and relationships, you can't get more basic than relationships. So it's really important, I think, to go back to those very foundations of what we do as social workers and think about relationships. Really, relationships are absolutely the golden thread of social work, and we often hear them described in that way, the golden thread of social work. And that always makes me think about, whenever I hear that phrase, the golden thread, and you do hear it quite a lot in social work actually, don't you? This golden thread, there's something that sort of is running through the seams of everything, that golden thread. Whenever I hear that phrase, the golden thread of social work, it always reminds me of the Hans Christian Andersen children's story, The Emperor's New Clothes. I don't know if you're familiar with this story or not, but the story goes that two people came along to an emperor and offered to make him the finest clothes ever, but it was all made up, it was all a swindle. But they'd convinced the king by saying only stupid people can't see this amazing thread. And so they convinced the king that they'd made him the most beautiful outfit and everybody else could see it. And it's a bit like that, really, for me. Is anybody actually going to say, hang on a minute, what is it? How do we do it? Are we just like ignoring it? We're just pretending that it's there, rather than shouting it out and saying, hold on a minute, everybody's talking about this golden thread, but what does it actually look like? What does actually relationship-based practice look like? And I do think, I suppose, a bit like the Hans Christian Andersen story, for me, I think there is a real problem that we have within society when our literature and in social work, our policy refers to the importance of relationships, because everybody just agrees with it. No one is going to say relationships don't matter. So we all just agree. But I think when you think about some of the sort of neoliberalism that is around, nobody's pointing out the gaps. Nobody's saying, hang on a minute, you know, maybe this isn't working or that's not working. Everybody's just like, yes, relationships, yes, they're really important. This week in England, the Children's Social Care Review reported on Monday, and it reported the first thing that the chair of the review posted on social media was, it starts with love. Now, who's going to argue with that? Who's going to say, no, it doesn't start with love? So from the outset, it makes it very difficult for people to say, we don't agree with what you're saying here. We don't agree with this, because it's almost like, oh, you're saying you don't agree that love's important then. It's this thing about, it's very difficult to argue against something that is so universally accepted, love, relationships. So it's very difficult to critique it or to take a critical stance. And I think that's what we should be doing as social workers. So I suppose in terms of the Hans Christian Andersen story, maybe we ought to learn from the mouths of children who, in the story, it's the child who shouts out, "The emperor's naked," that makes that statement. The elephant in the room stuff that's going on within social work at the moment, that we're not shouting about, we're not saying, hang on a minute, what is actually there? So there's a message, I think, in that story about relationship-based practice. What's actually there? What actually is there? There's a massive industry around relationship-based social work practice. But have you ever tried to really dig into it and think about, what does it actually mean? Beyond relationships are important and we should build relationships with people, what's it actually mean? Where does it actually go? How can you actually refer to this in some of your reflective writing, for example? If you're being asked to think about how do you connect theory with your practice, how do you do that around relationship-based practice when there's not a clarity really about what relationship-based practice is? I just need to grab something that I've left over there. Give me one moment. Now, left something behind. This is because we're late starting tonight. So this is taken from the Practice Supervisor Development Programme resources from Research in Practice. And it basically says the starting point of tonight, despite it being rooted in a well-established knowledge base, it's not uncommon to hear social workers and team managers referring to practicing in a relationship-based way. But when asked to explain what this means, there's often an embarrassed silence. The danger of this state of affairs is that relationship-based practice remains elusive and aspirational, as opposed to tangible and deliverable. So we do need a clarity about exactly what is relationship-based practice. What do we mean by it? How do we go beyond the surface of this is about relationships into the depth of what does this look like in social work practice? Research in Practice go on to say, whilst it remains insufficiently defined, it's impossible for professionals to know how to be relationship-based in their practice, what skills and knowledge they need to practice in this way, and what support they require to develop and sustain relationship-based practice. They're starting to look at what I want to make as the next point when they talk about knowing what support we as social workers require to develop and sustain relationship-based practice. But when I read this, I was quite concerned because it says it's impossible for professionals to know how to be relationship-based. Even if you just take that bit out, okay, we're lifting something out of the whole sentence, possibly taking it out of context. But for me, that's blaming of professionals. And where relationship-based practice doesn't happen, it's not often down to professionals. It's more often, I think, down to environments. For me, it is impossible to be relationship-based in what we might refer to as emotionally barren environments. If you've been to our webinars before, you'll know that we have a very good friend in Caroline Aldridge. We refer to her work a lot. Caroline joined us to talk about values-based practice. After I read her book, He Died Waiting, and it moved me so much. It still remains today one of the 3 books that has had the most impact on me in my social work career. When you think that that's been 36 years of a social work journey, one of 3 books shows the power of this book. And the phrase emotionally barren environments comes from this book. Caroline says this: there seems to be a prevailing philosophy of expecting social workers to be robust enough to cope with whatever the job requires. It's unsurprising that the burnout rates are so high. Apart from impacting negatively on the retention of experienced staff and being morally questionable, this attitude influences the way that practitioners work with those people who need services. Emotionally barren organisations set the tone for chains of poor emotional literacy. Leaders need to role model sensitive and attuned practice if they want their staff to treat the people who use services with respect and compassion. So we said that tonight we were going to use the what, why, and how framework. But I suppose before we do that, I want to say there's also a where. Where are we working and when are we working? That environment and context of social work practice at the moment is making it incredibly difficult for us to be relationship-based. So as we go through relationship-based practice tonight and we talk about some of the theories and models and methods that we might use as part of working in a relationship-based way, I suppose I want to recognise that I'm not placing the responsibility of all of this onto professionals' shoulders, that there's something here about the organisations in which we work not enabling good quality relationships to be developed as part of our practice. And I think that's important. And that's the bit that needs calling out. That's the emperor's new clothes bit, isn't it? That we can say, oh, this is all about the individual being relationship based, you know, that it's all on the individual practitioner. But hang on a minute, is it? What about the environment in which we're working? Let's call that out. Let's say relationship based practice requires emotionally fertile organisations. But in our back to basics, people like to know a bit about the theory and practice. I mean, these webinars are all about theory and practice, aren't they? You've been coming now, we've done 85 of them, you've been coming for a while, you know that these are all about theory and practice. And so if we were to break it down, and we've done this and covered this as a concept in so many of our webinars, breaking down what's a theory, what's a model, what's a method, what's an approach. We've looked at this many times. And we've used this illustration before. But if you think about it, what we have is in social work, we have particular perspectives, which is particular ways of looking at things. Out of those perspectives, the lens through which we look, come the theory that we use. Theory is about our understanding. How do we understand situations? Our approach is our overall way of going about things. The model that we use is a particular way in which we might respond in a situation. And the method is a specific tool or technique that we might use in practice. I suppose I set off planning tonight thinking, okay, where does relationship-based practice sit? Is it an approach that flavours everything else so that we think about relationships as part of everything that we do and we see relationships? If we take a relationship-based perspective, we look at the importance of relationships. And if we take a relationship-based approach, everything that we do is about the importance of relationships, building on relationships. And I was ready to do that. I was ready to talk us through, here's a relationship-based approach. Here are some of the theories we might use as part of that. Here are some of the models. I'm still going to do that. If I'm honest, I am still going to do that, but I'm not going to lay it out in such a formulaic way. And that's because Ingram and Smith, and I like Richard Ingram's work a lot, but Ingram and Smith in an IRIS publication, which is research based in Scotland, they say this: the centrality of relationships to social work continues to be universally and increasingly recognised. As we've said, nobody is going to say relationships aren't a good idea in social work. Relationships are variously described as being at the heart of social work, a cornerstone, an absolute precondition to social work. They're essential rather than incidental. Fuster suggests that within the caring role, the relationship is the intervention. In recent years, the concept of relationship-based practice has become a way of articulating the centrality of the relationship between social workers and service users. Relationship-based practice is not a method or an approach to social work that can be picked from a menu of alternatives. Rather, it's at the heart of whatever approach might be adopted across different client groups in different domains of practice. So I suppose I thought, actually, okay, it sits at the heart of everything that we do. So maybe rather than it being an approach or a model or a method, it is the heart of social work. And that beating heart of social work is then we draw on theories and models and methods as part of that. So there are lots of different threads. The opening image of an embroidery of a heart. There are so many different threads involved in relationship-based practice. But we said it was going to be a back to basics, and people come to back to basics to get a bit of theory, a few models, some ideas about methods, and that's what we're going to do in the webinar tonight. But it's perhaps going to be more of a kind of embroidery or a patchwork quilt of relationship-based practice, with bits and pieces that we might be able to draw on in putting relationships at the very heart of practice. So we're going to share some theories, some models, some methods, and some experience in relation to relationship-based practice. We start off with the golden thread. What's the golden thread? The golden thread of relationships. What might be the golden thread of relationship-based practice? For me, it's the letter P. We could stitch a lot of relationship-based practice around the letter P. I know I talk about this a lot, but the letter P works so well in terms of thinking about social work on many different levels. I refer a lot to the 3 Ps, the theory of the 3 Ps. My fear is that the 3 Ps that we use such a lot in social work at the moment, social work is almost becoming a technical activity rather than a relationship-based activity. The 3 Ps that underpin the kind of technical activity of social work is process, policy, practice, all that focus on those P words. Whereas if we're going to be relationship-based, the key 3 Ps, the 3 Ps that come from social pedagogy, which has such a lot to offer us in terms of relationship-based practice, because social pedagogy is all about the creation of relationships, the maintenance of relationships, and the use of relationships as a pedagogical approach. So the 3 Ps from social pedagogy talk about ourselves. We, all of us, have a private self, the self that nobody else knows about except our most intimate private partner in life. There's going to be 1 or 2 people in our lives that know our real private self. We all have a personal self. The personal self is the self that our friends and our family and our colleagues all know, that personal self. Who we are at weekends, what we do, what kind of programs we like to watch on television. If you've been to lots of webinars, you'll know bits about my personal self. You'll know I love cake. You'll know that Kelly likes to ask what you had for your tea, and that we like to think about crisp butties and all kinds of, you'll know bits of the team's personal self. But then there's also our professional self, who we are at work. Those Ps can help us to think about how we create different relationships. We have private relationships, intimate relationships. We have personal relationships, friendships, family members. We have professional relationships. We've got relationships on all of those different levels. But it can also, those 3 Ps, help us to think about the boundaries to relationships, how we create relationships. There is the most amazing story that a person, actually a mum who was in contact with social work services, told us. It appears in the SHARE book as part of the SHARE model. This mother who was in receipt of social work services was one of the stakeholders involved in developing SHARE. And I think it's the best way of understanding the 3 Ps, but also the best way of thinking about how we create relationships at work that I've ever heard. Very often we learn a lot from people's narratives, and this is a real life narrative. I'm going to share it in the woman's words, in this mother's words. So she was talking about going to a parenting program. She had 2 teenage daughters, and she'd been invited, she told us, to a parenting program. But she said, you know, it wasn't really an invitation. I wish social workers would be honest with their language. They said I was being invited, but if I'd have said no, well, it would have probably, everything would have gone into a child protection process, wouldn't it? There's a power dynamic here. Let's be honest about what we're doing. But she said, you know, I enjoyed it. We got a lot from it as a family, but let's just be a bit more honest about the power in these relationships, is what she said. But she said there were 3 members of staff involved in this parenting program. Let me tell you about them. She said, the first one, I'm going to call her the cold fish. She said, because she was a right cold fish. I spoke to this woman and I said, have you got children? And she said, this isn't about me, it's about you. She said, that's as far as I could get. She was a right cold fish. The next one, she said, was a man. And I said to him, have you got children? And he said, yes, my children are grown up now. I do remember the teenage years for our family as being a really difficult, challenging time, but we got through it. And she said, do you know what? I thought, he's all right, this guy. I'm going to get on with him. He's okay. He's not going to judge me. And then the third one, she said it was another woman. And I said to her, have you got kids? And she said, yes, I've got 3 children there called John, Jane and Mary. They're aged 3, 6 and 9. I'm divorced from their father, actually. He's got a new fancy woman and I don't like her. And I don't want my children going on holiday with them and they want to go away next week. And she said, I found myself turning into the cold fish because I thought, hang on a minute, it's supposed to be about me. It's not all about you. That is the best story that you will ever hear to illustrate the 3 Ps. The first woman, the cold fish, she was only willing to stay in her professional P at work. She wasn't willing to share any other aspects of herself in creating relationships. And if you want to do that, that's okay. It's safe, it's clear. It will have an impact on how you connect with others. The second one, the guy, he was willing to share just enough of his personal self to create a connection, a real relationship with the woman. He didn't blur the boundaries. He didn't push the boundaries, but he shared enough of himself. And the third woman, she didn't just blur the boundaries, she smashed through every boundary going and she made it all about herself. Thinking about how you use these Ps to think about how do you create a connection? How do we come together in the personal P? How do we use that connectivity? It's really important and it can work really effectively when we're thinking about relationships. So there's a starting theory for thinking about relationships, the 3 Ps. But actually, there's another, I think probably more important P in terms of relationship-based practice. You can use the chat to share what you think that word might be. If ever you've been to any of our A to Z webinars, you'll know that we ask you, what's this letter stand for? So if I said to you, in terms of relationships, what's the most important P? We've already shared 6 Ps. We've already talked about policy and practice and process. We've talked about the private, the personal and the professional self. I've even touched on politics at the start of the session, but what's the most important P in relation to making relationships? There's loads of Ps coming up in here. Look, I love the idea of passion and partnership and all of that. I did think that people were going to come out with people, completely was going to be about people. And lots of you have talked about people. I don't think I saw, when I took a quick look there in the chat, I don't think I saw what I think is perhaps the most important P in terms of relationships is purpose. What's the purpose of this relationship? In many ways, it connects to the 3 Ps. You know, the purpose of a personal and private relationship is very different to the purpose of a professional relationship. It also shows that blurring of the boundaries where that worker was making it all about themselves. The purpose of the relationship is key. What is the purpose of a professional relationship? It's really about finding the why, isn't it? And our back to basics sessions almost always take us back to this basic framework that I use for every single thing that I do. It's the most simple and yet most powerful framework you can ever use. What, why, how? I'm hoping that tonight, we've only got an hour, and relationship-based practice is huge, but I'm hoping in this hour you might be able to take something away of that patchwork quilt of what is relationship-based practice, why is it so important, and how do we do it as social workers? And that's what our back to basics sessions are about. But in terms of thinking about purpose, we often lose the why as social workers in our practice. Our practice becomes, what's happened? How am I going to deal with it? What's going on now? How do I respond this time? And when we do that, we've lost our purpose. We've also lost our passion. We've lost our connection when we lose the why. So using the what, why, how framework is really important. Thinking about relationships. What kind of relationship do you want to develop with this person? Why? And how is this relationship going to benefit the individual? Even just the basis of that can be a helpful starting point as a reflective tool if you're going to write an assignment, for example, or you're going to write a reflective account about relationships. But in terms of purpose, really try and think through in every single situation, what is the purpose of this relationship? Why is this important? And how is that purpose going to impact on how I create and maintain the relationship? Because sometimes people talk to me about, I'm building relationships with this person. Okay, what for? What's the purpose of the relationship? That's the key difference in many ways with professional relationships, is there is always a purpose to it. And the purpose is going to impact on it in so many ways. The purpose of the relationship might be varied. There might be lots of different layers to it, but we've got to be very clear about what's the point of this relationship. Relationships in and of themselves are not the purpose of what we're doing in social work. So what's the purpose of the relationship that we're building? Okay, let's look at some of the theories. Emotional intelligence is absolutely key to the creation of relationships. You'll find so much material available for you in terms of emotional intelligence. And if you want to think about the 5 main principles of emotional intelligence, really, emotional intelligence is about identification and management of emotions. That's essentially the bottom line is. It's about being able to identify emotions, your own emotions, and the emotions of other people. And it's about being able to manage your own emotions and, to some extent, manage the connection with the emotions of the other person. You can't manage the other person's emotions, but you can manage the connectivity with that person's emotions. So it's about identification and management of your own emotions as well as other people's emotions. And the 5 principles that really come out of that are about self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, understanding the emotions of others, and social skills, being able to create relationships, with the added aspect around motivation and what motivates you. So thinking through in terms of emotional intelligence, how do you create a relationship with somebody? You understand their emotional response to you, and you're able to recognize that emotional response and reflect on and wonder why that might be and how you might be able to work with that. Emotional intelligence is really key. The problem is, it's one of those things that's actually really difficult to measure and manage and think about. It's what's called a soft skill. And the key thing is that in terms of relationships, almost every skill we talk about is a soft skill. Managers are telling me all the time at the moment, oh, working from home is going really well. Productivity's up. What do we mean by productivity in social work? We mean more forms have been filled in, more boxes have been ticked, hard skill sets. It's the soft skills that matter, and it's the soft skills that are key in creating and maintaining relationships. So think about emotional intelligence. Okay, what about another bit of this quilt, this patchwork quilt of relationship-based practice, I suppose, or this embroidery of relationship-based practice that we're bringing together with all these different threads? In terms of the theory base around relationship-based practice, then what you'll find is that the prefix for loads of the words that we use around theory and relationship-based practice, things like the psychosocial model, psychodynamics, psychoanalysis, we use a lot of that. So we're building on this prefix. Even things like, if you look at Ingram and Smith's work again, the roots of an emotional dimension to social work, so that whole bit about that emotional intelligence can be traced back to the psychoanalytical and psychosocial models that appeared in the mid-20th century. They highlighted the importance of previous experiences and how emotions are managed and understood through relationships. So we use a lot of psychoanalysis stuff, psychodynamics, psychosocial models. It's where it all comes in. And the prefix of psych comes from the Greek. You know, think the psych is used in front of lots of things, isn't it? Psychiatric, we use that psych prefix. We see it coming up a lot in terms of words. And if you strip it back and take it right back to basics, it comes from the Greek for mind, spirit, consciousness, mental processes, the human soul, the breath of life. Literally, it's all about breathing, that breathes, that connects. This is about connections with breathing beings, really. Lots of things that you'll hear, lots of phrases that you'll hear that come from psychoanalysis, but we use then within relationship-based practice, things like transference, countertransference, splitting of emotions, projection, containment. All of this really matters. Having an understanding of that really matters. But I could only pick, because we've only got an hour, I could only pick out one part really of all of this psychoanalysis, psychosocial, where were we going to go with this? And so I've gone with transactional analysis. I love it as a theory. I think it is so useful. And actually, in many ways, when I hear students talking to me about communication theory, for example, there's not a lot of theory for communication, because theory is ideas of how things go. There's not a lot of theory. There's a lot of models of communication. There's a lot of how we do it. But this is a great theory of communication. Developed by Eric Byrne. It's still, I think, transactional analysis is still one of those things that's very much alive. Still, there's lots of people still building on the material around psychoanalysis. Essentially, transactional analysis is the analysis or understanding of transactions. And a transaction is what sits at the heart of a relationship. It's the backwards and forwards nature of communication. It's about the stimulus that one person gives to the other and the reaction back again. And that is what forms, in the theory, a transaction. One of the things that's really helpful to understand from transactional analysis is it builds on ego states. So it builds on things like the id and the ego and the superego, all of that. But the key element of the transactions, which the illustration showing here with the three little circles and the arrows going in different directions, is that transactional analysis says all of us have kind of three parts to us. We've all got a child in us, we've all got an adult in us, and we've all got parent in us. And professional relationships, when we're communicating with other adults, the best kind of professional relationship is adult to adult. When we're talking to our colleagues, when we're talking to other professionals, it should be adult to adult, that transaction. But it very often isn't. Very often we'll be hooked into a different way. So somebody will speak to us in a very critical way, which is seen as the critical parent. Sometimes we then go into an adapted child. Yeah, I'll do what I'm told. I'll just do what I'm told. We respond in different ways. How do we get hooked in? How do we support the people that we work with to communicate in an adult to adult way? Child to parent communication is perfectly, it's the right way to communicate between a child and a parent, is child parent. But between two adults, child parent communication and transactions are inappropriate, but can often take place. So if transactional analysis is something you're not, feeling fully confident with, go and explore it, because there is so much within transactional analysis about how relationships work, the games that people play, the scripts that we hold, the narratives that we have, how our feelings and emotions impact on relationships, thinking about how motivation needs for our basic needs. All of that comes into transactional analysis. It's a really great theory to get a hold of. And actually, there's some complexity to it, but the layers, if you break it down into the different parts, can be really helpful. Another aspect of the threads that we're pulling together is restorative practice. I think restorative practice as an approach to social work is great. It comes from really restorative justice, so used a lot in youth justice, used a lot in the criminal justice system. The work of Mark Finnis in this area is really worth looking at. He's got a little book, like a little pocket guide actually to restorative practice, which is quite based, well, it's very based on education and schools and restorative schools, but there's a lot in there that we could draw out of about how we create relationships, and it's really accessibly priced and accessibly written as a text. And Mark Finnis talks about, within restorative work, building relationships, connect before content. Sometimes you hear in schools connect before correct, but connect before content is what he says. You've got to have a connection before you can cover the content. And I think that's key in social work, isn't it? We've got to create a connection before we can get down to the detail of what we need to do, the detail of purpose. So we create the connection before the content of the interview, the assessment, the home visit comes. How do we connect with somebody? We need to create a sense of belonging. We know how important that is. Everyone needs a champion, Mark Finnis says. Everybody, child, adult, everyone needs a champion. Who's going to be the champion for the people you work with? That's that bit about being an advocate. How do you champion the person you're in a relationship with? He talks about the need to build goodwill, people needing to feel loved, the real basics that we know. He talks about labels belonging on jars, the need to build bridges, the need to check in and to check out. I don't know if you've noticed that every week on our webinars, we check in, we ask you a question. We try to use a different check-in technique tonight. We always check out by letting you know when we'll be around again and by waving, and there's a check-in, there's a check-out, there's a regularity to that. And that helps to create relationships. But perhaps the most important aspect, maybe not the most important aspect, maybe the most well-known aspect of restorative practice is the social discipline window. I've actually tried to draw this up on the screen here, partly because very often, if you look for images around the social discipline window, what you'll find is it talks about control and support and the balance there, because it comes from the criminal justice system. Within social work, you'll see the control axis is often changed to challenge. And what we need for really good relationship-based practice is high levels of challenge along with high levels of support. The idea of the social justice window is that if you give very low levels of support to people, along with low levels of challenge, you're basically showing I'm not interested. It's seen as the neglectful, irresponsible window, not doing anything. If you give high levels of support, along with low levels of challenge. You get the permissive, paternalistic, doing things for people. High levels of challenge with low levels of support are doing things to people. It's punitive, it's authoritarian. There's a lot of social work that's done to or for people. How do you get yourself into the with, restorative, authoritative aspects of practice? How do we do that? We give high levels of challenge to people along with high levels of support. But very often, because we lack time, we give high levels of challenge with low levels of support. We do things to people. Sometimes we just give high levels of support and very low levels of challenge, doing things for people. You see that a lot in adult social care, where things are just done for people because it's quicker. Come in, let's just do it and go out again, rather than doing things with people. Sometimes doing things for people can come from a position of love. You know, there's a whole range of different things that can happen here, whole range of different levels and different types of relationships that can connect in. But that's a little bit about restorative practice. It's very closely connected to relationships. It's an approach which has relationships seated at the heart. One of the key things about restorative practice and everything else about relationship-based practice is this understanding of yourself, self-awareness. You need to understand yourself. You also need to understand your own experiences of relationship. I'm not going to say relationships because it's not necessarily about all of your relationships, but it's about the concept of relationship. What does it mean to you? What is your experience of different kinds of relationships? What's important to you in relationships? What creates a good or a healthy relationship, in your opinion? And that stuff really matters. And what relationships look like for people is key. I've been doing a lot of work recently on kindness within social work, and that, you know, that'll be out soon, some of the theory around kindness in social work, building on some of the previous webinars that we've done. But as part of that research, I came across this from Jenny Malloy, you might have read some of Jenny Malloy's work. So Jenny Malloy is a care experienced adult. And she wrote this in an article, and it really captured me. And it connects about kindness, but actually key connection into relationships. Jenny says, as a child living in a chaotic home and later in care, any act of perceived kindness was welcomed. As an adult, however, I realised that I'd set a very low bar as a child for what constituted kindness. I would believe that someone speaking to me without anger, without shouting, or without aggression was kind. As a teenager, I thought it was kind when an adult, sometimes my parents, offered to buy me alcohol. An adult buying me drugs or hiding me when I was missing was the ultimate act of kindness. I realise now, though, that these acts were far away from what kindness should look like. The key thing about this is, what Jenny says is, social workers and carers are in the honoured position to alter this belief and to create a space for us to learn what we, as precious children, should receive as acts of kindness. You, as social workers, are in a privileged position at enabling people to understand what a good relationship is, what a healthy relationship is. If you listen to children, they know that being listened to is important. If you respond to adults, they know that that's a good relationship. That sometimes relationships involve challenge and sometimes relationships involve disagreement, but we can do that in a healthy way. We need to model that. So our use of self and use of relationship is key in relationship-based practice. There are other theories, like, for example, the social graces. We've talked about this before. Much of what relationship-based practice is built on, we've covered in different ways in different webinars. John Burnham developed the social graces actually for therapy, in the 1990s with Alison Roper Hall and some colleagues. Originally, it was called the disgraces, because it was all about building on an understanding of oppression and how oppression operates and inequality. But over time, they changed the dis, they took the dis off, and they also added in social before it to show that the graces are not just an individual thing, but also an environmental. They're not exhaustive. You know, the social graces, it spells out graces. That's the idea of why it's called the social graces. The mnemonic is the social graces. You can add to it, you can adapt it, you can change it. But the original graces, I suppose, the ones that are usually talked about are gender, geography, race, religion, age, ability, appearance, class, culture, ethnicity, education, employment. I would definitely, at the moment, more than ever before, add economics and understanding that people's socioeconomic status really matters. Sexuality, sexual orientation, spirituality. They're the graces. Now, the idea of the social graces is you think of yourself, this self-awareness, in relation to those. How do you identify in relation to each of those areas? Who are you? And then when you're creating a relationship with another person, who are they? And how do you connect that? What's the similarity? What's the difference? What might be the power dynamic? All of that becomes important to think about, to reflect on, and to discuss. But I think what's really great about the social graces is John Burnham's ideas about separating these out into what's visible in the graces and what's invisible. What can we see and what can't we see? And then what's voiced and what's unvoiced, what's spoken about and what's not spoken about. So some of those graces you will be able to see in the other person, but you might not voice it. So where there is a difference in your race and the race of the other person, it may well be visible. But if you don't talk about that, is that going to impact on how you create a connection? You might talk about the difference between you, make it visible and voiced, make it obvious. We can see it, we've talked about it. But there are also things that might be invisible. You can't see the difference, but you might want to talk about it. Equally, there might be hidden areas that are invisible and unvoiced. Think about what you're voicing and why you're voicing it. What might you want to think about in terms of how you create that connectivity? It's a useful theory and it's useful to use as a reflective tool, definitely. Some university social work programs teach the social graces very heavily, very significantly, and ask you to position yourself. And I know there's some programs where students specifically have to write a piece about their social graces. Some don't teach it at all. Prospero Tedham's Mandela model is a great relationship-based model. Specifically, it's a way of developing relationships. Models are all about what we do. We've said this lots of times. Prospero's Mandela model is all about relationships in practice education, and it builds on the social graces. The Mandela model's there, it's spelled out. The idea is you make time to acknowledge one another's needs, the differences between you, your educational experiences, your life experiences, and age. Prospero says that the Mandela model has the potential to draw out sensitive and really important discussions to enable a measured and respectful dialogue between practice educator and student. It's a model that really encourages power sharing by making time to hear about one another and recognise and appreciate differences, similarities. If you're a student, take this into supervision with your practice educator. Suggest that you might be able to use the Mandela model to consider and think about the relationship between the two of you, because this is a specific relationship building model. Prospero recognises that relationships are at the heart of promoting equality and diversity in practice learning settings. So when we're talking about relationship-based practice, and we're looking at, as I've tried to pull in some ideas about different theories and models and methods and ways of working with relationships, it's not just about relationships with the people that we support as social workers. It's about relationships with colleagues, with other professionals. It's about relationships within practice learning. So we've thought a little bit about some of the theories, some of the models, but what gets in the way? What cuts across relationship-based practice? I mean, I've started to put a few ideas and thoughts together. You might have others. My view is that labeling and language is a significant negative in terms of the creation of relationships. We've talked about this a lot. Restorative practice labels are, belong on jars, Mark Finnis says. But just think about, if you're talking about people as service users, as being disengaged or non-compliant, or, oh, it's disguised compliance. They're creating a relationship in a disguised compliant way. You hear that often, particularly in child protection services, that this person is resistant or hard to reach, or we've got resistant families, hard to reach families. These are phrases that I hear all the time. People who are difficult to place. You hear that a lot in social work. Just think about what that says and how that cuts across any ability to be able to connect and create a relationship. Often attitude cuts across relationships. A lack of commitment to relationships. You might say, oh, all social workers are very committed to relationships. I don't agree. I don't think that's the case. Some social workers seem to have a lack of commitment to the importance of relationships. There's an increased focus, I think, on process and procedure within the profession. I also worry that the over-professionalisation, what we've become, can that cut across relationships? Even think about how you present yourself. How do you turn up at somebody's home? What do you look like? All of that can cut across relationships. Organisational culture that doesn't promote relationships. Perhaps the most significant thing that everybody talks about in terms of cutting across the ability to create relationships connects to our webinar last week. Time, a lack of time. It's the core thing that everybody says gets in the way of relationships. The British Association of Social Workers, BASWA England, did an 80-20 campaign, which is all based around time. They said, based on survey information, that social workers tell us that 80% of their time is spent on administrative tasks, and only 20% is spent on direct relationship-based social work and reflection. So BASWA have created a number of guides and resources as part of the 80-20 project, which are well worth looking at. They've created a really good guide about how do we create relationships remotely with people. There's a lot of really useful tools and material there as part of the BASWA 80-20 project. If you're not familiar with it, it's worth looking at. Just Google BASWA 80-20, loads of stuff in there about relationship-based practice. And yes, time does get in the way. But I'd also say to you, we can still work on the development of creating a connection, recognizing the importance of relationships in people's lives, even in fleeting moments of time. Very recently, I had an experience of trying to source some care for my mum, and I had contact with so many different people over a period of time and a crisis situation. And there's one social care worker that stood out in my mind, who I only had one conversation with in all that time. But the way in which she spoke to me, the way in which she acknowledged the strength of and importance of that relationship really made a difference. And to me, that was relationship-based practice. I never met her. I spent 20 minutes in a phone call with her. It was a fleeting moment in time, but she took a relationship-based approach to what she did. So never think that if you're only allowed short amounts of time with people, or you only have time for very short amounts of time, If you work in a crisis team or a duty team and it's very quick turnaround, don't think to yourself, I can't create relationships, because we can create relationships in a fleeting moment. And so tonight we tried to put something together around theories and models and how you might be able to put all of that into relationships, because we know that sometimes students want to know from us some of the theories that they might want to think about and refer to in assignments. If you are thinking about assignment writing, don't forget relationship-based stuff is it's the stuff to go back to. It's the golden thread of every essay you could write through your whole social work career, because if relationships are the golden thread of social work, the theory and model around relationship-based practice can sit in every assignment that you ever do. So this could be useful to you in a whole range of ways. But there's a quote which, whether you can really attribute it to Carl Jung or not, is debatable, but it's an amazing quote. And this is the bit that matters more than anything else in tonight's session. You can know all of the theories, you can master all of the techniques, but as you touch a human soul, be just another human soul, because that's what relationship-based practice is. It's about connection on that level. You touch a human, be a human. And I wanted to conclude tonight by making some references to, again, it's still literature that we can draw on a lot in social work, but learning from unique hidden narratives in social work. Outlanders, which came out last year, is hidden narratives from social workers of colour. Insiders, Outsiders, which the launch of the book is tomorrow night. You can join us for that launch because it will be an amazing event, I'm sure, and probably the team will put a link into the chat now. But this is a brand new book, Hidden Narratives of Care Experienced Social Workers. And both of those books, they offer so much on so many different levels because they're wisdom from people with lived experience, their narratives. As social workers, we learn such a lot from stories. I started with a children's story, but we're going to end, that was a fairy story. These are real life stories in this book, and they show probably more than anything else the importance of relationship-based practice and that importance of being a human soul that connects to another human soul. Our very own Dave, team member, vital team member. Well, all the team members are vital team members, but you meet Dave a lot because he's always in the chat and keeping the chat going. He often starts off the webinars. And as a care experienced social work student, Dave contributed to the book. And this is a quote from you, Dave. So I'm going to hand over to you. Rather than me read it out, you can read it out. And if you want to add to it, you can. But this is your quote.
Thank you, Siobhan. And just to highlight, because you started off on a fairy tale kids story, my name legally is chosen after the Brothers Grimm, who are the kings of fairy tales. Mm-hmm. So this is my quote from my chapter in the book. I have grown up seeing social workers as my enemy, the people that would dictate and condone, the people that brought police or took us away from my mum, but not soon enough, and not as a sibling unit. The people who applied methods of intervention that directly led to my family disengagement and broken relationships. Now, there's more to the chapter, go and buy the book, but I think that's probably one of the most profound parts of my chapter. My relationships are all broken. I rely almost instinctively on my friendships because I don't have family relationships anymore. I try to maintain relationships with my brothers, but we don't have them unless they're drunk. We can't speak to each other. We don't have anything in common. We don't have like a mother-son relationship. We don't have uncles and aunties that talk to us. And I don't know how it went at the time. I went into care voluntarily. but at the same time, it was deemed appropriate for me to go into care from a household that was malfunctioning, but no one ever explained why my brothers didn't come into care. So when you're a social worker, or if you already are a social worker, maybe have a look at these decisions. Don't beat yourself up. Decisions were made. You probably had a justification at the time. But the big thing about this chapter that I wrote for the book was how I'm in conflict with myself at the moment, because I'm studying social work. But I very much believe that I'm walking in a shadow of social work, who have been there my whole life and broke my family and never ever helped to mend it. So I can't stress enough the importance of an actual relationship-based focus, but not a tokenistic one.
Thanks,
guys.
Dave. Thanks for sharing, Dave. Thank you for that.
I'm going to have to run off, Siobhan, for my friends in need, but I really appreciate tonight's webinar. I thought you smashed it, and you're a legend.
Thanks, Dave.
We'll chat to you soon, okay?
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Yeah, come to the book launch, guys. Yeah.
Yeah, see you tomorrow at the launch.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you. There's others. Thank you to Dave for sharing with us there. There are other people within who shared in Insiders Outsiders nuggets, golden nuggets of information about relationship-based practice. So Ian Thomas, who's another contributor, says relationship-based practice is more than a rhetoric that worryingly is being hijacked by bureaucracy and proceduralization. The harm that I experienced was done in relationship, but the healing has also taken place in relationship. Relationship-based practice is more than about what we create ourselves with the person we're supporting. It's about promoting and building and maintaining and restoring relationships between people. And I think Dave demonstrated that really clearly, and I think the rest of this book does too. I'm going to finish off with this quote from Ruth Allen, 2018. Ruth was just writing in the British Association of Social Workers, their PSW magazine. She wrote, social work is about life, treasuring humanity, building connections, sharing and promoting fairness. It's about creativity, care and love, being there to help people overcome obstacles and oppressions that hold them back. For people using our services, as social workers should be someone to trust and believe in, someone who helps you to believe in yourself. Sometimes we must hold boundaries, protect rights, advocate and challenge. We're always in the midst of the messy stuff, finding ways forwards. I think that's a really good way of thinking about what social work is. But I'm just going to finish off by picking out relationships. Relationships are about life. Relationships are about treasuring humanity and one another. They're about building connections. They're about sharing. They're about promoting fairness. Relationships are about creativity, care, and love. Relationships mean that we're there to help one another to overcome obstacles and oppressions. Relationships give us someone to trust and believe in. Relationships provide us with someone who helps us to believe in ourselves. Within relationships, we hold boundaries, we protect rights, we advocate and we challenge, and relationships are messy and they're about finding ways forwards. So social work is relationships. That's the bottom line. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated. Social work is relationships. If you think about the threads, they are messy, really messy. We've tried today to kind of show you a little, what is relationship-based practice about, but the threads, they're messy. Look in more detail, look behind, look what's behind it in social work, and it's messy. Love cannot be commodified. That's a fear, I think, around what's coming in English social work at the moment. We need to think about and understand connection, and that's going to be unique in every situation. We need to recognise that problems are very often relationship-based, but solutions are almost always relationship-based. We need a renewed focus in social work on the importance of relationship, but a meaningful one, not a tokenistic one, as Dave said. And the use of self is key in thinking about the use of relationship. So I hope that in our Back to Basics session tonight, we've provided something for you to think about, a thread that you can take away and stitch something with. And so next few weeks, you know what we've got coming up. Actually, this slide now has everything that we've got for this season. So next week, social work and mental health. A context session will be joined by a range of guests talking about their experiences of working in mental health. We've then got a Back to Basics on reflective practice. We're then continuing part of our anti-racist commitment with our special guest Chantel Thomas looking at adultification. We'll then be doing a session on neurodiversity and social work, and finishing off with an A to Z. We like to finish every season with an A to Z, as you know, having a bit of fun together with our A to Z, and we'll be doing it on social work education. And we've then got a bit of a break and we'll be back in September. So that's what we've got coming up. If you'd like to register for next week, I do think it's going to be a great session next week. We've got lots of guests. It's a very packed session. So do join us for our context session on social work and mental health. And on behalf of the team, thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we'll maybe see you next week. Good night, guys. Bye, everybody. Bye.